Never forget. I have this. This term. You know, we all know when there are major things that happen in our lives, things that change our lives forever. I mean, these are things we remember and that are with us constantly and change how we think and how we behave. Those are major changes in our life. But I think that our lives are also dominated by things that are much less apparent. Sometimes you may not even know what they are. I call them invisible epiphanies. You like that, huh?
I like that. I'll steal it.
I'm sure. I'll tell you about two of mine. When I was maybe 8, 9 years old, perhaps, I was walking with my mother along the main stem and past this music store with a big window, enormous display window. And it had pianos, grand pianos, and lots of brass. But tucked in the corner of this window was a point of sale card. And it was probably no more than maybe 12, maybe 15 inches high. I have no idea what it was advertising at this point. But it reproduced Dali's image, The Persistence of Memory. You know that famous image? Melting watches, And I was frozen to the spot. I remember my mother trying to pull me away, but I couldn't move. I was literally paralyzed because I didn't know before that moment that something that could never exist could be shown. What a fantastic idea that was. That changed my life forever. There's another one. The first time I heard Rhapsody in Blue, it was never the same again. So you see what I mean? Invisible epiphanies. These are things that bombard us all the time, and sometimes we may not know for years or maybe never. I remember to this very moment the first time I laid eyes on a Wally Wood page. It was from the comic book Weird Science. Very early, the story was called The Aliens. And I remember it was a Saturday. I had been in my city around to the used comic shops and bought a little stack of comics, and I went home, and it was about 4:30 in the afternoon. I still remember the quality of the summer day. There was a quiet golden hue about it. And I remember opening this page. I saw this Wally Wood splash, and I was never the same again. It was one of those invisible epiphanies. And one of the really beautiful things about being in this business is this phenomenon of getting to meet your heroes. As a kid, I read comic books. I read the Kirby books. I read the Joe Manili books. I read the Stan Lee books. And of course, I was a big EC fan. Probably the best writers and the best artists, the best colorists in the business. And years later, had the privilege of actually meeting and hanging out with Woody. So I still consider him to be not only one of my primary influences, but one of the greatest of all artists, maybe in the world, because Woody could do everything. He could do cartoons like nobody. He could do realism. He could do Hal Foster. He could do Alex Raymond. He could do westerns. He could do horror. He could do he could do everything and do it superbly. And I don't know if anybody's ever quite defined this, but there was something magical about his line. I can't tell you what it was. I can't explain it. Sometimes you cannot explain this aspect of magic. It's just there. Somehow there was something going on with Woody. He had like the Midas touch. He could take almost anybody's work, anybody's pencil work, and turn it into a wood job just by inking, just by going over it. Just an amazing thing. So Woody had, a profound impact on me and on all of comics and maybe all of the illustration world, because I think there are people that are still looking at his work, being influenced by it.
Before we get into when you met him, I want to get to where Paul first became aware of his work. But I keep hearing something. Anybody know where that sound is coming from?
I think it's in the speaker.
It's like a
PA. I think it's the session downstairs.
Okay. All right.
You get to have two panels for the price of one.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Paul, were you following Wood's work at all before you came into the industry, started working in the industry?
Well, I didn't know it at the time, but I was enjoying Woody's work even younger than Jim was, even before I was able, I think, to fully read the comics. I didn't realize it for years, but I think it was my 50th birthday party. Michael Uslan got me as a present a replica lunchbox, because I had told him the story of my, I don't know how we'd started bullshitting about it, my sort of first grade or kindergarten lunchbox for bringing lunch in. And I was an enormous fan of Fireball XL5 and the other super animatronic nonsense that Jerry Anderson was doing out of England at the time. And I remembered my Fireball XL5 lunchbox, and Michael got it for me as sort of a gag gift for that. And I looked and said, shit, this is Woody's. That line, that power in it was so recognizable even through that airbrush painted look that he was striving to do to match that. I realized that I had fallen in love with his stuff and was carrying it around proudly before I read the first comic that I touched of it.
Well, the Fireball was 65. Jim was rating the Weird Science about 53, so he still got you beat.
He's a little older than I am. I was doing it at what age I was at.
Right, that's
Jim
true.
did everything before I did. He was doing comics history long before I did, and certainly anything that I've done in that area has been based on the kind of seminal work that he did a decade before.
But that's almost exactly the time that I came in too, and I was a big Fireball fan too. But unfortunately, I didn't have the Fireball lunchbox. But my earliest Wood was right when he was transitioning from Mad over to Marvel on Daredevil. The early Daredevil, and also at that time they were doing the Mad paperbacks. So I was getting Wood mostly in the early Mad paperbacks at the same time that he had just shown up over at doing Daredevil for Marvel. So, so when did you meet Wood and how did that go, Jim?
I think maybe I met Wood at his home and studio. I forget, it was uptown New York. What street would that have been on?
It's like in the 70s by Central Park West.
Well, actually, he had a number of apartments adjacent to Central Park.
Well, after a while, he got a separate studio apartment at the end of the same block over by Amsterdam.
Was that the one that he was still living with Tatjana at that place?
Well, they were still married, but he was spending a lot of time at the apartment facing Amsterdam. I don't know who was coming and going in that apartment, I couldn't say. But I've heard rumors.
Well, I called Woody up, or got a recommendation from somebody who connected me with Woody along the way. And he was really a remarkable guy. I mean, all I knew about Wood at the time was that a couple paragraph bio that ran on the inside cover of the UC books. He was an ex-paratrooper. I came from Minnesota. Woody was, actually I think there were many Woods. Not many people know this, but Woody played guitar and sang. He was a kind of performer, and not bad at it either. On the other hand, Woody could be the shyest guy you've ever met. I remember I'd always try to take Woody out to dinner because I got the feeling that man cannot live on cigarettes alone. So I used to call him whenever I could get away and take a couple of hours in New York. I used to call Woody up and take him out to dinner. And even that was an experience. We'd order dinner at some restaurant, and we would say, have the salt over here. Woody, for God's sake, what the hell's going on? Are you having like a little mashed potatoes with your salt today? Uh-huh. I think Woody had a death wish. And, that was probably borne out by the way he left us, ultimately. But he was a very interesting guy. And easily maybe the most talented individual we'd be ever inclined to meet. And there are a lot of talented guys in this business. Woody was remarkably soft-spoken. And it always vexed me because, like, let's say at dinner, we were, at opposite sides of a table. And Woody was very, very soft-spoken. We'd be like this. So I begin to shift over like this to try to not miss every pearl of wisdom. And the closer I get, the lower Woody's voice. Until finally, at the end of the night, I'd have my head in his mouth. Now go figure, a guy who could do this kind of dynamic work that I think has never been equaled. For example, his science fiction work in Weird Science and Weird Fantasy. I know many of you know him from his Marvel days or his work at Warren. Or at DC.
At DC, I mean, the All-Star material he did keeps getting reprinted, and Power Girl's more popular than ever. So I'm always surprised, the DC stuff's hanging on strong.
But the truth of the matter is, and this, of course, is arguable, I think the best material that Woody ever did was his EC science fiction work that he had a penchant for that nobody has ever come close to topping in over 50 years.
Is there an argument to be made for that, Jim, also, that it's the combination of his incredible talent, but also sort of the moment in time? He was able to define the look of science fiction for a couple of generations because his sense of what machinery was, his sense of what the mechanical world could and would be, was way ahead of what the science fiction illustrators of the time were generally doing.
And also, like Joe Orlando would say, Joe Orlando was his partner in the 50s, and they were close until the end. And I used to spend a lot of time with Joe, and obviously Paul did too. But he would say, you have to look back in time. Part of Jim's perspective, and I'll debate Jim a little bit on this, because I think he's a little nostalgic for the time, but it's exactly what Paul's talking about, is you can't take the work, I don't think it's proper historically to take the work out of the time it's in. It may stand alone in any time, it may be classic enough to do that, but if you take it in the time it's in, you get a better view of it. And for that time, and as Orlando would say, it was a very modern look. And there's also quotes from Eisner that talks about this, when he talks about when he brought Wood in to try to revive the Spirit, when the Spirit was failing toward the end. He said, looking back decades later, he marvels at how modern the work looked even decades later.
I think there's one other piece to that puzzle. Woody and Joe were both working in the same studio at that time with Harry Harrison. And Harry's not remembered particularly in the comics community at this point, but was a major science fiction writer and wrote the story that Soylent Green was based on, Make Room, Make Room. And I only met him towards the end of his life briefly, and he was cheerfully telling me stories about when Joe was a pimply-faced young kid showing up in the office, which as the pimply-faced young kid who had showed up in Joe's office, I thought was sort of an interesting turn of the wheel. But I think, without ever having heard any of the three of them talk about it specifically, that was a very unusual studio, in that Harrison was both sort of, is it fair to call him a failed or a second string comic book artist, but you had Joe, who would turn into one of the greats of the field, Woody, who almost instantly was, and you had this guy who obviously had a fascinating science fiction mind. And I think part of what may have been percolating around was a set of conversation about the science fiction world, just other people's art, other things that were going on. I'd love to the time machine to be a fly on the wall there to see what was going into Woody's head that put this, it's more than a style, put this world view together that just everybody's been following for a generation or two since. I mean, we still write our art direction in terms of, make this a Kirby Wood machine.
Well, another thing too is part of what you're saying leads me to this kind of concept of a kind of a salon, where they weren't just working together, they were practically living together. And when people talk about later in his career, Wood would have assistants, I really think that he worked so many hours, this was like his only chance to socialize. It's kind of like Steranko, when he comes to a convention, he's working and he's socializing. He gets to kill two birds with one stone. I think Wood was like that, and especially at that original studio, the Harrison Wood Orlando studio. They were talking, Orlando would tell me how they talked politics. When he first came in, he was raised very conservative Italian Catholic background. And Wood and Harrison...
They fixed that.
They worked on him. They made jokes about the Pope, and he was like, no, I can't hear this, until gradually, and Joe would say gradually, they totally turned me around politically. And, Jules Pfeiffer used to pop in there every now and then to chit-chat with those guys. So, yeah, that was definitely a hotbed of activity. There's a story later when, around the time Jim comes in, he met Wood, was when Wood had just left Daredevil and just getting Thunder Agents rolling for Tower. And he was suddenly hiring lots of people to work. Tower said, look, as much of the work as you can do, we want you to do it. We want you to be the creative lead of the whole line. So he was hiring Adkins and Bill Pearson and Lynn Brown and just Ralph Reese and all these different people. And there was a story, I forget who told me this, but he went and got Tatjana and brought her in, and it was like 2 o'clock in the morning or something. And he had this whole room full of artists working, all feverishly working at 2 o'clock in the morning. And he had this grin on his face. It's like, it reminded him of the early studio in the 50s when they had like, as many drawing boards as they could cram into the room and everybody just cranking out the pages. But that was, that was a high point to him. And he was nostalgic about that going back to the 50s.
I have a question for Jim. You knew Woody at that moment in time. Wits End is born almost at the same time as the Thunder Agents work. And I was just the right age to fall in love with Thunder, and it was a wonderful series of comics. But Wits End, I think, ultimately you have to look at as one of the real pivots of the history of our business, because it's the first moment that essentially the independent comics movement is born. What was going on in his mind, in the mind of the people who were contributing? What was in the ether at that time?
That's a very interesting viewpoint, Paul. I don't know if I quite consider it in the same way that you do, but Woody was influenced by the people around him, those that you just mentioned, Dave. For example, Dan Adkins, who was my best friend for many, many years, died last year. Adkins worked in science fiction fanzines before he went to New York. He was from East Liverpool, Ohio. And all of those guys were comics fans and science fiction fans. And I think that their discussions, that is, while they worked, while Woody was working, they were working in the same studio, the discussions of all this fanzine stuff kind of drifted into Woody's psyche, and he developed this idea that if I got my friends together, you know, like from Frazetta, you know, the EC guys on down, the people I know now, the science fiction writers and artists, I could put together my own magazine. And I could probably do it better because I'm Woody and I've got these guys, and they're gonna, you know, they'll be uncensored. They'll be unchained. We'll be able to produce material that no other publisher would ever produce. It was a terminal disappointment to Woody that he could never get Wits End really on the stands. It was never anything more than a glorified fanzine. And I think in the long run, it hurt him and changed his view of the whole operation. I know I contributed pages to Wits End along the way. I was very excited about it just because I was able to repay a debt, a personal debt that I had to Woody because he was so inspirational, you know, to my own career. I think he had the same feeling with Sally Forth. I think because Sally never really made it big, you know, I mean, it was distributed in, what was it, Army
Stars and Stripes.
newspapers?
Right, it was called the Overseas Weekly.
That's right.
It wasn't the official military paper, but it was distributed to PXs worldwide, and was of particular interest to GIs in Vietnam, both Cannon and Sally. And there was actually a third strip that ran for a shorter period, a Western, called Shattuck. But see, when he did Wits End, there was no distribution for such a product. It didn't exist. I mean, it was a rebellious thing, and it actually did come out of the roots of an idea that Atkins had proposed. Atkins was going to do a fanzine, asked Wood if he'd contribute to it, and gradually everyone realized if Wood put it out, it would do better than if Atkins put it out. And then Atkins started getting more work too. So that kept him busy, and Wood turned it into Wits End. But it also, if you look in there, you've got the top name pros contributing, but you've also got underground guys coming in there. And the first Wits End predated, you know, you can argue about exactly what the first underground is, but one that people tend to cite that had a major impact. Some of the earliest undergrounds were only like 100, 200 copies, so nobody really, you know, they're there historically, they predated something, but the one that really made the difference was Zap 1. Well, Wits End 1 predated Zap 1 by a good solid year. And there were underground guys that, and there was a welcoming. Most of these underground guys were fans of the EC material. They were totally inspired by Mad. If you look at a lot of the early underground comics, they were imitating EC cover designs on the underground covers. And now they're getting to work in a magazine that's run by Wood, had contributions, there were a few contributions by Kurtzman and some other EC guys. So that was, you know, a great feeling of validation. It's like a father, culturally, a father to like his cultural offspring in a way, even though they were all it's the rebellious children, the underground artists. So, but I'd like to say that Wits End is just now being collected and going to be released any moment in a big 2-volume hardcover.
It's already out. I have a copy. It's here.
You got your copy. I ain't got mine yet.
Your name's Steranko.
I think the reason, what you just said about it though, in part that is why I feel as strongly about it, when you look at the underground material, it was a very conscious act of countercultural rebellion, whereas you felt it, although in Wit's End it very much was the artist not wanting the restrictions of the comics code, the restrictions of the publishers, it wasn't countercultural in the same fashion. It was about creative imagination across a wide spectrum, genres that they had worked in before, but now I can really do it right. And we don't focus on it very much in the current generation because you're used to comics being printed on offset presses and in decent fashion. But you think of the awful reproduction you got at the beginning of your career to those amazing pages. Wit's End was suddenly somebody actually printing this on a press where your work would appear.
The counterculture aspect was in the revolt. The artists and writers, the creators, were revolting against the publishers by creating their own material. That's you know where that aspect came into play, and you could make a correlation, you know, probably with the underground guys. But you know, you brought up an interesting thing.
Well, Wood wrote an editorial called The Big Blue Pencil.
Hold on a second. The names of the underground guys that were influenced by the EC work, and particularly by Wood, I think is a pretty long list. And I think we could start that with Rick Griffin, one of the greatest of all the underground artists and designers, but absolutely so. And who else would fall into
I would
that?
say Crumb too.
Marginally, Crumb's work was a lot like Severin and Elder's, you know.
It's a coarser line. But you know what, Mandy's an expert on the undergrounds. Mandy,
I am.
Give me a couple of names. Give me a couple of names. EC or Wood influenced underground artists.
Kim Deitch, I know, was heavily influenced by EC work.
John Pound.
Pound, John Pound.
Yeah, Pound,
Pound
yeah.
flavor, but you could say all kinds of people. Rory Hayes, Rick Griffin,
Who did
Irons,
Trash Man?
Greg Irons.
Spain Rodriguez.
Spain, yeah,
Rodriguez.
Spain would fall into that category.
And
absolutely.
Jack Jackson knew Wood. In fact, there's some video, the only known video I know of Wood was shot at an EC convention, I think it was around
72.
72.
Yep.
And it's in Wood's hotel room. And the room is packed full of young, long-haired people, all into undergrounds, including a bunch of underground artists, including Jack Jackson and his girlfriend, who Al Williamson was very fond of. And Al, a couple people popped their head in momentarily. Al Williamson pops his head in, a very young Bill Stout pops his head in, Roy Krinkle pops his head in, all saying things like, you know, I'll see you downstairs at the awards or something like that. But the guys that were crowding the room were, for the most part, either serious EC and underground fans or underground artists themselves.
Probably Lynch was there, probably Spiegelman was there.
Spiegelman was definitely around, and in this room, though, definitely Jackson was in there too.
That was a hell of a weekend.
But I was mentioning that he wrote an editorial called The Big Blue Pencil.
Could you say that 3 times fast?
Pencil.
About 1 time.
And I actually believe, after spending a lot of time with Joe Simon, I believe the Big Blue Pencil editorial was inspired by a situation that had happened at Harvey that Simon told me about, and he was so proud that they had gotten Wood to agree to do a couple stories when Harvey was doing this line of superheroes in the mid-50s. And someone there at Harvey called for the new superhero artist to come have a meeting, and Wood came in there, and the